Section B, the heart under suspicion? Masters of suspicion. General Audience number 46 of October 29th, 1980. For a long time now, our Wednesday reflections have centered on the following statement of Jesus Christ in the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you, whoever looks at a woman to desire her has already committed adultery with her, toward her, in his heart. Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 to 28. We have just clarified that these words cannot be understood or interpreted in a Manichaean key. See TOB Audience 44, paragraph 5 through Audience 45, paragraph 5. In no way do they contain a condemnation of the body and of sexuality. They only contain a call to overcome the threefold concupiscence, and in particular the concupiscence of the flesh. A call that springs precisely from the affirmation of the personal dignity of the body and of sexuality, and only confirms this affirmation. Clarifying this formulation, that is, determining the proper meaning of the words of the Sermon on the Mount in which Christ appeals to the human heart, see Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 28, is important not only because of the deep-seated habits that stem from Manichaeism in the way of thinking and evaluating things, but also because of some contemporary positions that interpret the meaning of man and of morality. Ricker has called Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche masters of suspicion, maîtres du soupçon, having in mind the whole system each one represents, and perhaps above all the hidden basis and the orientation of each in understanding and interpreting the humanum itself. It seems necessary to take at least a brief look at this basis and orientation. We should do so to discover, on the one hand, a significant convergence with, and, on the other hand, also a fundamental divergence from the hermeneutics that has its source in the Bible and that we are attempting to express in our analyses. In what way does the convergence consist? It consists in the fact that the thinkers mentioned above, who have exercised and still exercise a great influence on the way of thinking and evaluating of people of our time, seem in substance also to judge and accuse the human heart. Even more, they seem to judge and accuse it due to what biblical language, especially Johannine language, calls concupiscence, the threefold concupiscence. One could distribute the role as follows. In Nietzschean hermeneutics, the judgment and the accusation of the human heart correspond in some way to what biblical language calls pride of life. In Marxist hermeneutics, to what it calls concupiscence of the eyes. In Freudian hermeneutics, by contrast, to what it calls concupiscence of the flesh. The convergence of these conceptions with the hermeneutics of man, based on the Bible, consists in the fact that when we uncovered the threefold concupiscence in the human heart, we too could have limited ourselves by putting this heart in a state of continual suspicion. Yet the Bible does not allow us to stop here. Although Christ's words in Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 28 show the whole reality of desire and concupiscence, they do not allow us to turn such concupiscence into the absolute principle of anthropology and ethics, or into the very nucleus of the hermeneutics of man. In the Bible, the threefold concupiscence does not constitute the fundamental and certainly not the only and absolute criterion of anthropology and ethics, although it is without a doubt an important coefficient for understanding man, his actions, and their moral value. Also, the analyses we have carried out so far show this. Precisely when we wish to arrive at a complete interpretation of Christ's words about the man who looks with concupiscence, Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 28, we cannot rest content with just any concept of concupiscence. Even if the fullness of psychological truth accessible to us were reached in this way, we must rather draw on 1 John chapter 2, verse 15 to 16, and on the theology of concupiscence contained there. The man who looks to desire is in fact the man of the threefold concupiscence. He is the man of the concupiscence of the flesh. This is why he can look in this way, and should even be aware that when he leaves this interior act at the mercy of the forces of nature, He cannot avoid the influence of the concupiscence of the flesh. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 and 28, Christ speaks about this as well and calls attention to it. His words refer not only to the concrete act of concupiscence, but indirectly also to the man of concupiscence. Essential divergence. Why is it that these words of the Sermon on the Mount, despite the convergence between what they say to the human heart and what is expressed in the hermeneutics of the masters of suspicion, cannot be considered the basis of the hermeneutics just mentioned or one analogous to it? Why is it that they constitute an expression, a configuration of an ethos that is totally different? Different not only from the Manichaean, but also from the Freudian ethos. I think that the whole of the analyses and reflections carried out so far answers this question. Summing up, one can say in brief that Christ's words, according to Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 and 28, do not allow us to stop at the accusation of the human heart and to cast it into a state of continual suspicion, but that they must be understood and interpreted as an appeal addressed to the heart. This derives from the very nature of the ethos of redemption. On the foundation of that mystery, which St. Paul defines as redemption of the body, Romans chapter 8, verse 23, on the foundation of the reality called redemption, and as a consequence, on the foundation of the ethos of the redemption of the body, we cannot stop at the mere accusation of the human heart on the basis of the desire and concupiscence of the flesh. Man cannot stop at casting the heart into a state of continual and irreversible suspicion due to the manifestations of the concupiscence of the flesh and of the libido uncovered, among other things, by a psychoanalyst through analysis of the unconscious. Redemption is a truth, a reality, in the name of which man must feel himself called, and called with effectiveness. He must become aware of this call, also through Christ's words, according to Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 and 28, reread in the full context of the revelation of the body. Man must feel himself called to rediscover, or even better, to realize the spousal meaning of the body, and to express in this way the interior freedom of the gift. That is, the freedom of that spiritual state and power that derive from mastery over the concupiscence of the flesh. Man is called to this rediscovery by the word of the gospel. And so from outside, but at the same time, he is also called from inside. The words of Christ, who in the Sermon on the Mount appeals to the heart, lead the listener in some way to such an inner call. If he allows them to work in him, he can, at the same time, hear in his innermost being the echo, as it were, of that beginning, of that good beginning to which Christ appealed on another occasion to remind his listeners who man is, who woman is, and who they are reciprocally, one for the other in the work of creation. Christ's words, spoken in the Sermon on the Mount, are not a call hurled into emptiness. They do not address the man who's completely bound by the concupiscence of the flesh, unable to seek another form of reciprocal relations in the sphere of the perennial attraction that accompanied the history of man and woman from the beginning. The words of Christ testify that the original power, and thus also the grace of the mystery of creation, becomes for each one of them the power, that is the grace of the mystery of redemption. This concerns the very nature, the very substrate of the humanity of the person, the deepest impulses of the heart. Does man not sense, together with concupiscence, a deep need to preserve the dignity of the reciprocal relations that find their expression in the body thanks to its masculinity and femininity? Does he not feel the need to impregnate them with everything that is noble and beautiful? Does he not feel the need to confer on them the supreme value, which is love? Rereading this appeal contained in Christ's words in the Sermon on the Mount cannot be an act detached from the context of concrete existence. It always signifies, even if only in the dimension of the act to which it refers, the rediscovery of the meaning of the whole of existence, of the meaning of life, which includes also the meaning of the body that we have called spousal here. The meaning of the body is in some way the antithesis of Freudian libido. The meaning of life is the antithesis of the hermeneutics of suspicion. Such a hermeneutics is very different. It is radically different from the one we discover in Christ's words in the Sermon on the Mount. These words bring to light not only another ethos, but also another vision of man's possibilities. It is important that precisely in his heart, he does not feel himself irrevocably accused and given up to the concupiscence of the flesh, but in the same heart, he feels himself called with energy, called precisely to this supreme value, which is love, called as a person in the truth of his humanity, and thus also in the truth of his masculinity and femininity, in the truth of his body, called in that truth which has been his inheritance of the beginning, the inheritance of his heart, which is deeper than the sinfulness inherited, deeper than the threefold concupiscence. Christ's words, set in the whole reality of creation and redemption, reactivate that deepest inheritance and give it real power in human life.